As I've been working on my fourth book about horror game design, it meant retreading through a lot of what was considered the death of survival horror in the mid thousands. And for today's critical thought, we're going to be talking about some of the essential lessons that horror developers forgot, and some warnings for developers wanting to create their own games right now. When it came to kind of the rise and fall of survival horror, a lot of that is attributed to Resident Evil, and specifically the action horror trilogy of 4 through 6, and we could probably throw in Resident Evil Revelations in as well. Now, the footage you're seeing is from Resident Evil 3, but it will certainly probably follow the lines of what we saw in those older games. That during the mid 2000s, there was this greater push towards more action based design. The rise and success of Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, and just, again, more of the action movie focus became prevalent with even games like Resident Evil. And starting from 4, action horror design became more and more of the forefront of it. Now, with that came changes to the design and scope that we would see other developers emulate, especially, of course, everyone's favorite series, Dead Space, that the third game kind of became indicative of this action movie focus. But horror became downplayed in favor of more action. Now, with Resident Evil 3 Remake that came out last year, we started to see that same kind of trend, with less puzzle solving, more focus on combat and doing these kinds of quick time dodges, and so on. But when it became like the worst was again with Resident Evil 5 and 6. 4 gets a pass for being the first one of its kind and still being in that transition period between survival horror and action horror. But starting from 5, developers at Capcom were very much focused on making combat the forefront. And while they're still monsters, it's not really as scary. Part of it is because of the greater focus on power. That the player themselves has a lot more options to them than what you would normally see in these kinds of games. You can move and shoot. Not just move and shoot, you can aim and hit enemies in different locations to hurt them. You have, Chris Redfield's Super Punch, Leon Kennedy's Mighty Kick, and so on. Or Jill here with her Super Dodge Roll powers. The point is that as the survival horror genre evolved, the horror aspect was becoming more and more downplayed in favor of more action. And even with that said, the power curve was growing and growing, with the abilities to upgrade your character, your weapons, and just making yourself more and more powerful in a franchise or a genre that already had trouble with the power curve when it was even focused on survival horror. And what we began to see was that developers were just not really trying to do anything different. They were all just chasing after Call of Duty money. In fact, one of the quotes from the director of Resident Evil Revelations basically referenced Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto as kind of the games gamers really wanted at that time. Because as we all know, all video games are just Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. Or Madden, I guess I should throw in as well. So, what ended up happening is that this greater focus on action-focused design left these games feeling very generic and vanilla in terms of their gameplay. In the back half of this video, we're going to show footage of Resident Evil 6. And if I didn't say anything, you probably wouldn't think it would be a horror game, because it really isn't. There's monsters in it, but you're not really feeling scared. There's no real sense of horror or tension. And Resident Evil Revelations, which you don't have any footage of that on the channel, and I'm debating if I won't actually stream that game, that may be too scary for the audience here for the wrong reasons, but it really represents the quote-unquote high point / low point of action horror design. And that is, if you're removing the horror and replacing it just with more gunplay and more combat, You don't really have a horror game. You have an action game with monsters in it. You have Doom, or Doom Eternal, as we saw a year ago. Now, we're going to take our quick break now. When we come back, we're going to load up some footage of Resident Evil 6 and show off how this game began, or it became, the embodiment of what killed survival horror. And now for a quick thank you to our current Patreon supporters. And if you're interested in my books on design, they are available at most major retailers. 20 Essential Games to Study is for first-time developers looking to be inspired, and the Game Design Deep Dive series covers the history and philosophy of major genres, with horror coming later in 2021. When it comes to showing off how much the horror aspect of Resident Evil was downplayed, Resident Evil 6 is the best example of this. And here's the interesting point. Like, from a design point of view, this is a good game. The action is very responsive, the gunplay is there. The problem, though, is that this is not horror, as we watch Leon roundhouse kick a zombie multiple times. But what we saw was this very big push towards co-op play. But not co-op play in terms of survival horror, something like Left 4 Dead or Dead by Daylight, but again, more action-based design. And you can certainly do horror co-op. Sorry about I accidentally kicked my friend there. But you can certainly do horror co-op style. And we even saw Resident Evil do that with the very much, I think, underrated Resident Evil Outbreak series, which I'm still waiting for them to redo that kind of design. But with Resident Evil 6 here, what we saw was basically a overriding sense of raising the power curve of everyone involved. The zombies in this game can jump at you from like 5 feet away and catch you in an unavoidable QTE. I can kick and suplex most enemies and kill them. Right now you don't see it, but I have a shotgun, assault rifle, sniper rifle, and I believe we get a magnum as well. All in, Leon's lovely little coat there. But the problem, there's my weapon overlay right there. The problem is that none of this is creating tension. It's creating action. And some of the big lessons that developers had to learn, what we were still seeing, I'm a little concerned about with Capcom, is how much combat is the focus. With Resident Evil 6 here, this is basically 90% of the game, with maybe 10% puzzle solving. Resident Evil 7, despite being a quote-unquote return to form, still had a lot of combat, especially in the back half. And while people are certainly praising Resident Evil 8 for having the attache case that you can, equip items to, that makes me very nervous, because I saw Ethan getting his hands on looks like a high-powered sniper rifle. And again, sniper rifle doesn't necessarily equal horror. Now, what we saw from a lot of independent developers was just a complete reversal away from Resident Evil and, of course, Resident Evil 6 here. And that was removing all combat and arguably all gameplay mechanics as well. And that doesn't work as well. There needs to be interaction for there to be horror. I need to be in control of my character. But the character should not be in complete control of the situation. And what we saw again with the growth and downfall of Resident Evil and survival horror was making the character too much in control. Dead Space, as I said in the last part, suffered from this as well. That as the series went on, Isaac Clarke went from being every man stuck in a bad situation to super badass profanity-spewing Chosen One, who was the sole one who had killed the Necromorphs, until he got his very chummy friend. They were arguing and fighting each other in Dead Space 3. And with these kinds of games, you have to be very careful, again, with how much power you give the player and what are they dealing with. You see, in this game, as you see me fighting this, giant, oversized zombie, there's no explanation for why they grow like that. That's not really a fight. That's just a giant bullet sponge or a roundhouse kick sponge. And that doesn't make things horrific. Again, combat needs to have a very even measure to it to work. This is why the Silent Hill series holds up a little bit better in terms of survival horror, while arguably Resident Evil holds up better in terms of just moment-to-moment or gameplay. Now, along with Resident Evil 8, I am still concerned, besides the greater focus on combat, is how they're going to handle the back half of the game. One of the issues we have with horror is that the back half of a horror title is always more action and less mysterious than the first half. Resident Evil 7, from the boat on, I did not like that game, and it kind of made the whole experience worse because of it. Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, always has very action or very combat-heavy elements in the back half of these games. And it's very hard to extend a survival horror game. And why so many indie developers today are focusing on micro horror, which I may do a video on that in the future. But the idea of making a horror experience is maybe 20 to 40 minutes, and it's almost like a episode of like The Twilight Zone or Tales from the Dark Side. Now, to begin to wrap things up, Resident Evil 6 and games like it went so far into action that they removed what was the real focus of these games, and that was horror. And here's like the kind of the dirty little secret. If we compare the quote-unquote action, or the action gameplay of something like Dead Space or Resident Evil 6 to pure action titles, these games don't really hold up that well. Like, pure action games give you a lot more control, they're a lot more fluid to play. The Resident Evil franchise, as you were trying to, fit a square peg into a round hole with action and horror, it just ended up feeling like a lesser of a game. And this is what I'm really worried about with Resident Evil 8, and with any more ideas they have. That they try to keep pushing the action or the gunplay, and not following that up with anything else, it's just going to end up being a very poor action title with some beautiful visuals. I know everyone's excited about some of the character designs of 8. And I think ultimately for survival horror to work, it needs to have action and adventure. Arguably, the adventure should be the greater focus than the action. And when it's not, you run into situations where it just feels very generic. And Resident Evil 6 just got to that point where we're just going through the motions of shooting and killing everything, which again is not a bad gameplay loop, but it's not what we want to see. We're trying to be scared. So with that said, thank you so much for watching this video. If you're new, be sure to check out the Discord and Patreon link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games, and try and roundhouse kick as many zombies as we can.